At 7:40 p.m. on her final night, Marilyn Monroe made a phone call that lasted 22 minutes. The person on the other end was never named in any official report, and that conversation has never been explained. August 4, 1962. Saturday afternoon in Los Angeles. The sun hung low over Brentwood, casting long shadows across Marilyn Monroe's modest hacienda-style home on Fifth Helena Drive. Inside, the house was quiet, almost too quiet for a woman who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by noise. Studio executives, photographers, directors demanding perfection, fans screaming her name. For 20 years, Marilyn Monroe had lived inside a hurricane of attention, expectation, and pressure that would have broken most people long before. But on this particular Saturday, the world's most famous woman was alone. The house on Fifth Helena Drive was small by Hollywood standards, just 2,900 square feet, 4 bedrooms, a modest pool in the back. Marilyn had purchased it only 6 months earlier, her first real home, the first property she had ever owned in her own name. She called it her fortress, a place where she could finally be herself, away from the cameras and the constant scrutiny. The walls were white, the tiles were terracotta, Mexican-style architecture that felt warm and safe. She had decorated it carefully, personally selecting furniture and art pieces that meant something to her. Books lined the shelves, serious books, philosophy and literature and poetry. This wasn't the dumb blonde the world thought they knew. This was a woman who read Dostoevsky, who studied with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, who desperately wanted to be taken seriously as an artist. But the house that was supposed to be her sanctuary had become something else in recent weeks. A place of isolation, a place where the silence felt heavier each day. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, moved through the house performing routine tasks. Eunice was in her late 50s, a calm and efficient woman who had been hired on the recommendation of Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist. Some would later question this arrangement. Why would a psychiatrist recommend a housekeeper? Was Eunice there to help Marilyn with domestic tasks, or was she there to monitor her, to report back on her mental state, her visitors, her phone calls? These questions would surface later, after everything fell apart. But on this Saturday afternoon, Eunice simply moved through the rooms, straightening pillows, preparing light meals that Marilyn barely touched, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, had visited earlier that afternoon for what he would later describe as a productive session. Greenson had become deeply involved in Marilyn's life over the past 2 years, far more involved than traditional therapeutic boundaries would typically allow. He saw her almost daily. He involved himself in her professional decisions. He had even arranged for his own daughter to befriend Marilyn, blurring the lines between doctor and patient in ways that would be considered highly unethical by today's standards. But in 1962, in Hollywood, the rules were different, especially for someone as valuable and as vulnerable as Marilyn Monroe. Dr. Greenson's notes from that final session have been the subject of intense scrutiny over the decades. What exactly did they discuss that afternoon? How did Marilyn seem? Was she suicidal, depressed, anxious? Dr. Greenson would later tell investigators that Marilyn had been in relatively good spirits, better than she had been in previous weeks. He saw no immediate cause for alarm, but those notes, like so many other pieces of documentation from that day, were unusually brief, vague, almost deliberately uninformative. What had been left out? What observations had Dr. Greenson chosen not to record? Her personal physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, had also checked on her health status earlier that day. Dr. Engelberg was responsible for managing Marilyn's prescriptions, a complex and dangerous cocktail of barbiturates, sedatives, and other medications that she relied on to sleep, to function, to get through each day. The dosages were high, dangerously high, and yet the prescriptions kept coming. In Hollywood's golden age, doctors who were willing to write prescriptions without too many questions were invaluable to studios and stars alike. Dr. Engelberg was one of many physicians who kept Hollywood running on pills and injections and carefully managed dependencies. To the outside observer, it seemed like a typical weekend day for someone under intense medical supervision. 2 doctors, a live-in housekeeper, regular check-ins and monitoring, the machinery of care surrounding a fragile and valuable star. Yet something beneath the surface was shifting. Something that those closest to Marilyn either didn't see or chose not to acknowledge. The morning had started slowly. Marilyn had slept late, as she often did. Sleep was both her escape and her torment. She craved it desperately, but struggled to find it without pharmaceutical assistance. When she finally emerged from her bedroom around 11 o'clock, she seemed subdued, quiet. Eunice later recalled that Marilyn spent much of the morning in her bathrobe, drinking coffee, flipping through magazines without really reading them. The kind of restless, unfocused energy that comes from exhaustion that sleep can't cure. She made a few phone calls that morning, brief conversations with her publicist, her lawyer, logistical discussions about her career, about the lawsuit she was planning against 20th Century Fox for firing her. But beneath the practical talk, there was an undercurrent of something else. A weariness, a sense that the fight was becoming too much. Marilyn had been sleeping poorly for weeks, months really, if she was honest with herself. The insomnia had become chronic, debilitating. She would lie awake for hours, her mind racing with anxieties and memories and fears that wouldn't quiet. The pills helped, but they came with their own problems. Tolerance, dependency, the constant need for higher doses just to achieve what used to come easily. The studio that had made her a star, 20th Century Fox, had just fired her from the troubled production of Something's Got to Give. The official reason was chronic lateness and absenteeism. Marilyn had missed dozens of days of shooting, arriving hours late when she did show up, sometimes too ill or too medicated to work effectively. The studio had lost patience. They terminated her contract and filed a lawsuit seeking damages. For Marilyn, this wasn't just a professional setback. It felt like a repudiation of everything she had worked for. She had fought so hard to be taken seriously, to be more than just a pretty face, to prove that she was a real actress with depth and talent. And now, at 36, she was being cast aside as unreliable, difficult, past her prime. The tabloids were circulating rumors about her relationships with powerful men in Washington, whispers about President John F. Kennedy, whispers about his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Marilyn had moved in powerful circles, too powerful perhaps. She had attended parties where politics and Hollywood intersected. She had been seen with men whose names carried enormous weight. And in 1962, at the height of the Cold War, with the Kennedy administration navigating crises in Cuba and Berlin and Vietnam, any scandal involving the president could have devastating consequences. How much did Marilyn know? What had she been told in private moments? What secrets had been shared in confidence that she might intentionally or not reveal? These questions haunted those who had the most to lose. Her phone, normally ringing constantly with calls from agents and producers and men who wanted something from her, had gone strangely quiet in recent days. It was as if Hollywood had collectively decided to step back, to create distance, to wait and see what would happen next. For someone whose entire identity had been built on being wanted, being desired, being needed, this silence was devastating. She was 36 years old, exhausted, uncertain about her future, and carrying secrets that, even decades later, remain partially hidden. The entertainment industry that had built her up was now carefully dismantling her. The men who had pursued her were now avoiding her calls. The studios that had profited enormously from her image were now calculating whether she was still worth the trouble. Marilyn understood this calculus better than most. She had always known that her value in Hollywood was conditional, temporary, subject to the brutal mathematics of age and beauty and bankability. But understanding it intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two very different things. As evening approached, Marilyn made several phone calls from her bedroom. She called her friend and masseur Ralph Roberts, and they chatted about nothing in particular. She called her former stepson, Joe DiMaggio Jr., and they had what he would later describe as a pleasant, upbeat conversation. She called Peter Lawford, actor and brother-in-law to President Kennedy, though that call would later become the subject of intense speculation and conflicting accounts. Casual conversations with friends, brief check-ins, the kind of calls anyone might make on a Saturday night when they're feeling restless or lonely or simply human. But one call was different, and this is where the official record stops making sense. At approximately 7:40 p.m., Marilyn's phone line became active. The call lasted 22 minutes. Phone company records from Pacific Telephone would later confirm the duration and the approximate time. The timestamp was clear, the duration was documented, but the recipient, the most crucial piece of information, was absent. 22 minutes is not a brief conversation. It's not a quick check-in, or a wrong number, or a casual hello. 22 minutes suggests substance, intimacy, perhaps urgency. Think about your own phone calls. 22 minutes means you're telling a story, working through a problem, making plans, sharing fears, seeking comfort. 22 minutes means the conversation matters, that it's important enough to hold your attention for nearly half an hour, that you have something to say, and someone willing to listen. But here's what makes this call extraordinary. The recipient was never officially identified, not in the initial police reports, not in the coroner's investigation, not in any of the official documentation that should have carefully catalogued every detail of Marilyn Monroe's final hours. The call existed in records as a ghost, present but unexplained, documented but mysterious. In the days following Marilyn's death, investigators requested her phone records as part of standard procedure. When a high-profile figure dies under questionable circumstances, phone records are essential. They establish timeline, they reveal relationships, they provide context for mental state and social connections. What they received was incomplete. Certain calls from that final evening were documented with times and durations, but without the corresponding phone numbers. Other calls appeared to have been removed from the log entirely, leaving gaps that made no sense. It was as if someone had taken scissors to the official record, carefully cutting out the information they didn't want revealed while leaving enough to maintain plausibility. When journalists began investigating years later, and many did, because Marilyn's death never stopped generating questions, they discovered something even stranger. Multiple people claimed to have spoken with Marilyn that evening, but their testimonies didn't align with the documented call times. Peter Lawford said he spoke with her around 8 o'clock, and that she sounded groggy, slurring her words, saying goodbye in a way that alarmed him. But no call to Lawford at that time appeared in the records. Ralph Roberts insisted he never received a call from Marilyn that evening, yet a call to his number was documented. Joe DiMaggio Jr. confirmed a conversation, but couldn't remember the exact time. Some calls that were remembered never appeared in records. Other calls that appeared in records were never acknowledged by anyone. The 7:40 p.m. call, the 22-minute conversation, fell into a category that investigators would come to recognize as deeply problematic, documented but unexplained. It existed in the official timeline like a black hole, present only by the distortion it created in everything around it. Who was on the other end of that line? This question has consumed researchers, journalists, conspiracy theorists, and serious investigators for more than 6 decades. Several theories emerged over the decades, each with its own logic and its own gaps. Some investigators believed Marilyn was speaking with someone from her past, perhaps an old friend or former lover, seeking to reconnect. Joe DiMaggio, her second husband, remained devoted to her years after their divorce. Could it have been him? But DiMaggio was in San Francisco that day, and he would later demonstrate genuine shock and grief at her death. Others suggested she was making arrangements, though arrangements for what remained unclear. Was she planning a trip, discussing a new project, seeking help with her legal battles? The length of the conversation suggested something more substantial than casual chat, but without knowing the content, any explanation remained pure speculation. A darker theory proposed that the call involved someone powerful enough to have records altered or suppressed, someone whose connection to Marilyn Monroe needed to be erased from history, someone with access to law enforcement, to phone company records, to the mechanisms of cover-up. In 1962, such power was not theoretical. It existed, and it was exercised regularly to protect certain interests. What we know for certain is this: Marilyn Monroe spent nearly half an hour in conversation with someone during the final hours of her life, and that someone has never been publicly identified. The content of that conversation remains a mystery. Was it a cry for help? A confession? A goodbye? Was it mundane or profound? Did it contribute to what happened later that night, or was it simply a random moment that took on significance only in retrospect? We may never know. But the absence of information is itself informative. In investigations, what's missing is often as revealing as what's present, and in this case, the deliberate obscuring of a documented phone call suggests that someone, somewhere, decided this information was too sensitive to remain public. But the phone call wasn't the only thing that disappeared that night. In the immediate aftermath of Marilyn's death, several pieces of documentation went missing in ways that strained credibility. Her personal diary, a red leather-bound book she was known to write in regularly, was never found. Multiple witnesses confirmed its existence. Marilyn's friends had seen it. She had mentioned it in conversations, referring to it as a place where she kept her private thoughts, her observations about Hollywood, perhaps even details about her relationships with powerful men. The diary vanished sometime between the night of August 4th and the official investigation that followed. It was never entered into evidence. It was never catalogued by police. It simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Where did it go? Who took it? What did it contain that was worth removing from a death investigation? These questions remain unanswered. Friends and colleagues confirmed she kept detailed notes about her life, her thoughts, her concerns. Marilyn was more intellectually curious and observant than her public image suggested. She paid attention. She remembered. She wrote things down. And that habit, that desire to document her experiences, may have made her dangerous to people who preferred their secrets remain hidden. The diary vanished, and with it potentially the most direct window into Marilyn's state of mind during her final weeks. What fears had she recorded? What names had she mentioned? What plans had she contemplated? We can only speculate, because the evidence was removed. Phone records, as mentioned, were incomplete or altered. This wasn't simply an administrative error or bureaucratic incompetence. Phone company records in 1962 were methodical and reliable. Pacific Telephone kept detailed logs precisely because they were essential for billing and legal purposes. The selective gaps in Marilyn's records suggest deliberate intervention. Someone with authority and access made those records incomplete. Dr. Greenson's session notes from that final afternoon were unusually brief, leading some to wonder if more detailed observations had been removed or destroyed. For a psychiatrist seeing a patient in crisis multiple times per week, detailed notes would be standard practice. Yet Dr. Greenson's documentation from August 4th was sparse, almost perfunctory. He noted that Marilyn seemed improved, that the session was productive, but little else. Was this really all he observed? Or had more sensitive material been redacted or discarded to protect either his reputation or information that might complicate the official narrative? Even the timeline of that evening became fragmented, with testimony that shifted and changed over the years. Housekeeper Eunice Murray's testimony changed multiple times over the years, each version contradicting the last in subtle but significant ways. She initially stated she discovered Marilyn's body around midnight, becoming concerned when she saw a light under the bedroom door and found it locked. Later, she revised this to 3:30 a.m., claiming she had checked on Marilyn earlier and everything seemed fine. In interviews conducted decades afterward, she admitted there were details she had been told not to discuss. Who told her to stay silent? What details were too sensitive to reveal? Eunice's evasiveness suggested that she knew more than she ever publicly acknowledged, but whether from fear, loyalty, or legal pressure, she took those secrets largely to her grave. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation, which should have been thorough and methodical, was instead rushed and incomplete. When a celebrity dies under questionable circumstances, the investigation typically involves extensive interviews, forensic analysis, careful documentation of the scene, and thorough review of all available evidence. In Marilyn's case, the investigation was cursory. Officers arrived hours after the body was discovered, already a major red flag. The initial classification of Marilyn's death as probable suicide came remarkably quickly within hours, despite numerous unanswered questions and inconsistencies in the evidence. No suicide note was found. The pattern of drug ingestion didn't match typical overdose scenarios. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts, and yet the determination was made swiftly, almost as if there was pressure to close the case before it could become more complicated. Toxicology reports raised questions that were never fully addressed. The levels of barbiturates in Marilyn's system were extremely high, fatal levels, but the manner of ingestion was puzzling. There were no pill residues in her stomach, which would normally be present after swallowing a large quantity of pills. Some medical examiners suggested the drugs might have been administered differently, perhaps through injection or suppository, but these possibilities were not thoroughly investigated. The physical state of Marilyn's bedroom, meticulously organized, almost staged, struck several investigators as unusual for a suicide scene. Everything was too neat, too arranged. Suicides, especially those involving drug overdoses, typically show signs of distress, disarray, empty pill bottles, water glasses, perhaps a note. Marilyn's bedroom looked peaceful, almost serene, as if she had simply gone to sleep. Some saw this as evidence that she had carefully prepared herself. Others saw it as evidence that the scene had been arranged after the fact, and the delay in calling emergency services, hours passed between the discovery of her body and the arrival of police, has never been satisfactorily explained. In any death investigation, timing is crucial. The immediate response, the preservation of the scene, the documentation of conditions, all of this must happen quickly to maintain the integrity of evidence. In Marilyn's case, there was a gap of several hours. What happened during that time? Who was called? What conversations took place? What decisions were made about how to handle the situation? The delay suggests that someone was managing the narrative, making sure everything was properly arranged before involving official authorities. But perhaps most troubling of all, in the years following her death, people who knew details about that final night began to reconsider their public statements. Some admitted they had been pressured to remain silent by individuals they couldn't name. Others hinted at information they couldn't share due to powerful interests who preferred the official narrative remain undisturbed. Peter Lawford, who had been one of the last people to allegedly speak with Marilyn, gave contradictory accounts over the years. His story shifted, details changed. He seemed to be struggling between truth and loyalty, between what he knew and what he was allowed to say. The phone call, that mysterious 22-minute conversation, became symbolic of everything hidden about Marilyn Monroe's final hours. It represented the missing pieces, the redacted information, the convenient gaps in the record. It stood for all the questions that were never properly asked, and all the answers that were deliberately obscured. And when investigators finally tried to reconstruct what really happened, they discovered something that changed everything. The timeline of August 4th into August 5th contains gaps that nobody has ever successfully filled, despite decades of investigation and countless attempts to establish a coherent sequence of events. Eunice Murray stated she saw Marilyn alive around 8 p.m., shortly after the mysterious phone call ended. She claimed Marilyn seemed in good spirits, perhaps even better than she had been earlier in the day. Marilyn had retreated to her bedroom, saying goodnight, closing the door. Everything seemed normal, routine, just another quiet evening at home. Dr. Greenson reported receiving a call from Murray around midnight expressing concern. He rushed to the house, arriving quickly. His own home was nearby. He discovered Marilyn's bedroom door was locked from the inside. They called through the door but received no response. Growing alarmed, Dr. Greenson went outside and broke a window to gain entry. Inside, he found Marilyn lying face down on her bed, the phone clutched in one hand, lifeless. But here's where the story fractures into irreconcilable versions. The official police report states officers weren't called until 4:25 a.m., more than 4 hours after the discovery. 4 hours. Why the delay? What was happening during those 4 missing hours? Multiple explanations have been offered over the decades, but none fully account for the missing time. Some suggested Dr. Greenson needed time to process the shock, to make difficult phone calls, to notify relevant parties before involving police. Others suggested something more sinister, that those hours were used to remove evidence, to clean up the scene, to make sure nothing problematic remained when official investigators arrived. The delay remains one of the most damaging aspects of the case, casting doubt on everything that came after. And the phone call. If Marilyn had been speaking with someone she trusted, someone close enough for a 22-minute conversation, why didn't that person come forward after her death? In any normal circumstance, if you had spoken with someone for nearly half an hour on the night they died, you would volunteer that information to investigators. You would want to help establish timeline, to provide context, to offer any insights that might explain what happened. The silence of this unknown caller is deafening. Why didn't they report hearing anything concerning? Why didn't they offer information that might have helped investigators understand her final state of mind? What did they have to hide? Or perhaps more accurately, what did they have to protect? The silence is telling. It speaks to power, to influence, to the kind of connections that allow certain information to simply disappear when it becomes inconvenient. Over the years, speculation has pointed toward powerful figures who had reason to distance themselves from any association with Marilyn Monroe's death. Names have been whispered in documentaries and true crime investigations, though rarely stated outright due to legal concerns and lack of definitive proof. Connections to Washington, to the Kennedy administration, to organized crime figures who had their own complicated relationships with Hollywood and politics, to Hollywood's deepest machinery of control and image management, which protected its investments ruthlessly and efficiently. But speculation is not evidence, and evidence in this case was either incomplete or deliberately obscured. What remains is a phone call. 22 minutes, never explained. A documented fact that leads nowhere, answers nothing, but suggests everything. A woman who spent her life being watched, photographed, recorded, and scrutinized, and yet her final hours contain mysteries that persist more than 60 years later. The paradox is almost unbearable. Marilyn Monroe was perhaps the most visible woman in the world. Her face was everywhere. Her life was documented obsessively. Millions of photographs, thousands of hours of film, countless interviews and articles and gossip columns, and yet when it mattered most, in those final hours, the record goes dark, the details disappear, the truth becomes elusive. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5, 1962. The official cause, probable suicide by barbiturate overdose. The word probable is itself revealing. It suggests uncertainty, an acknowledgement that the evidence doesn't quite support a definitive conclusion. But probable was enough to close the case, enough to file away the questions, enough to let everyone move on. But the phone call that evening, the conversation that lasted 22 minutes with someone who was never identified, represents something larger than just missing documentation. It represents all the questions that were never properly asked, all the evidence that was never fully examined, all the people who knew something but chose silence because speaking up would have been dangerous or inconvenient or career-ending. The world remembers Marilyn Monroe as a Hollywood icon, a symbol of beauty and vulnerability, and the price of fame. She represents an era when studios controlled stars completely, when image was manufactured and maintained regardless of the human cost, when women in entertainment were valued for their appearance and their compliance rather than their humanity or their complexity. But the truth of her final night remains frustratingly incomplete, obscured by missing records, conflicting testimonies, and the passage of time. Every year that passes makes definitive answers less likely. Witnesses die, memories fade, documents are lost or destroyed. The window for truth closes incrementally, day by day, until only questions remain. That 22-minute phone call is a reminder. Even in death, Marilyn Monroe carried secrets too powerful to be fully revealed. Secrets that implicated people too important to be exposed. Secrets that threatened reputations and legacies and carefully constructed public images. And perhaps that's the most tragic part of all. That a woman who gave so much of herself to the world, who allowed herself to be photographed and filmed and discussed and dissected, still couldn't escape being used, still couldn't control her own narrative, still couldn't protect herself from those who saw her as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be valued. The mystery endures, not because we lack information, but because the information was deliberately removed. The questions persist, not because investigators were incompetent, but because powerful forces preferred those questions remain unanswered. and Marilyn Monroe remains an enigma, not because she was unknowable, but because those who knew her best chose silence over truth. 22 minutes, a phone call, a conversation lost to history, and with it perhaps the final piece of a puzzle that will never be completely solved.